Welcome back to Zuko Builds. I got a new table saw and I'm super stoked because I can finally make jigs. I had an older Ryobi 10-inch table saw and the miter slots had these weird tabs that didn't allow me to use the miter slots. So the first thing we're gonna make is a freaking crosscut sled. I have it set up so you can use a single blade or move it over here and you have a dado slot now. It's gonna be a fun build, guys. Let's get right into it. For this project, I'm using 3/4 inch plywood and I'm gonna start by ripping down the fences. I'm gonna have 4 cuts total. That's gonna be 2 pieces of plywood glued together on the front and the back side, and I'm gonna rip these down to about 3 1/8. Be sure to cut them slightly oversized, just so when we're done with the glue up, we can rip them back down and clean up those edges that might have any glue squeeze out on them. With all 4 pieces cut, let's go ahead and glue these up. Make sure you're only gluing 2 of these at a time instead of all 4. Obviously, you're just gonna have one big block if you glue all 4, so don't be silly. And to help make sure that everything is nice and flat, I'm just using a level to clamp everything. I got this tip from Tamar over at 3x3 Custom. While the glue is setting, I'm gonna start cutting out the runner for our sled. I'm using hard maple. Try to use a hardwood, they'll last a little bit longer, and honestly I think they slide a little bit better. You can also use cutting board material like that hard plastic, but either that or some hardwood would work perfectly fine. I went ahead and cut a little template just out of some scrap pine. This is to make sure I have the proper width and height, and I use pine just so I'm not wasting a bunch of hardwood. Obviously it's a little more expensive. For the width, you want it to be able to slide freely through the miter slot, but you don't want any wiggle room on the left or right side. And for the height, I just keep it slightly proud over the table saw. And once you have a template that fits nicely, let's go ahead and use that to set our fence and cut it out of our hardwood. I went ahead and let that glue set overnight since the glue is the only thing keeping these 2 boards together, and I'll rip off about a 1/16 of an inch on either side just to clean up any glue squeeze out that might have occurred. Go ahead and sand the pieces that'll make the fence, being sure to leave the bottom alone. We want that to be as flat and straight as possible since that's what's going to be mounting to our sled, but I'll go ahead and round over the other edges and sand down the other faces. Now let's go over to our router. I'm using my router table here, but you can get it done with a trim router or even a dado stack. This is to route out the slot for the T-track that's going into your fence. So I'm using a 3/4 inch bit and just adjusting it to the height of this T-track. Now we're gonna run our fence with the top side down. Obviously we're gonna have the T-track on the top of the fence. So make sure your router fence or whatever you're using is nice and secure, and let's run our cross sled fence. I'm gonna put a fence counter up on the screen. Or not, I'm not that tech savvy. Fence, yeah, press the fence against the fence. And if you routed that out clean, this T-track should fit perfectly with the 3/4 inch bit that you used. I'm making my sled so that I can use a single blade or a dado stack in it. For the single blade, I want my sled base to be centered on the blade, so I went ahead and marked out the center of the base and just put my table saw blade directly in the middle of that line. I I made sure to leave my table saw fence exactly where it was so I can use it as a reference, and I'm going to go ahead and mark out where the miter slots are. This is because I'll be using CA glue and accelerator for the runner, and I need to know where I'm spraying that accelerator. To install the runner, you want to place some pennies or even some washers in your miter slots. This is going to lift the sled runner up a little bit so that it can make contact with your sled base, and we'll wait for that glue to dry a little bit and then flip over the base, drill some pilot holes, and fasten it with some screws. I'm drilling about 5 pilot holes for the runner, and I'm making sure to countersink these because you don't want the screw head to be protruding at all. You want it to be flush or even sitting below the surface of your runner. To fasten these, make sure you're using screws that are short enough so they won't pop out of your sled. These are, I believe, 3/4 inch screws. Anything around that range should be fine. Before we can cut through our sled, we want to make sure to take off our riving knife, but first unplug your damn table saw. You want to keep those fingies for as long as you can. And also, don't take off your riving knife unless you're using a sled. It's super dangerous to use your table saw without a riving knife. Now I'm just making sure that everything still slides nice and freely without any sort of wiggle. And I'm going to place a little bit of pressure on top of the sled base and slowly raise the table saw blade. I'm going to cut right in the middle. You'll see why in a second. So I only cut through the center of my crosscut sled. That's so I can add this block, which is going to act like a fence on the front side of your base. And this is going to support either side of the plywood. I'll go ahead and use more CA glue and accelerator just to hold it in place so I can flip it over, drill some pilot holes, and fasten it with some screws. We can then go ahead and cut through the front side of our sled, not cutting all the way through just yet, and you'll see why in a second. Before we cut all the way through, we want to have our rear fence sit nice and flush and square to the blade. I'll go ahead and use the table saw fence to butt my crosscut sled fence up to it, making sure it's nice and flush on the right side. Secure it down with the screw, and then I'll check for squareness from the fence to the blade. To check for squareness, I'm not doing any sort of crazy math. I'm not using the 5-cut method. I'm simply taking a square, squaring it up with the blade, and hoping that this works. If not, I'll tweak adjustments. And before making a test cut, let's go ahead and fasten the loose side down. The moment of truth is making your first test cut. Now, I thought I got this on camera, but I didn't. I tried to show how square this came out, but there was absolutely no light shining through. I held it up in different angles, different directions, and this thing came out pretty square. So you don't have to have a super complex mathematical problem to get your fence square to your blade. I simply used a square, and that worked for me. Now that we know everything is lined up properly, everything is square, we can cut all the way through our sled. To help remind us to keep our fingers away from where the blade is coming out, take a scrap piece of wood. This is just some scrap from the fence, and mount it over that blade kerf. If your fingers are touching that block, do not push your sled through. Come on guys, don't be silly. If your fingers are on the block, take your fingers away, move them over to the side. Just keep those fingies, man. That's all I'm saying. And like I said earlier, this is going to be used for a single blade and for my dado stacks, which is why I only have one runner. I can easily move it over to the left and make my slot for my dado stacks. The process is exactly the same, so I'm not going to bore you guys with me talking over all of this. The only difference is I'm going to be using a dado stack rather than a single blade. You might be wondering why it's so thin. I just started with a 1/4 inch dado stack, and that's just so I can see where my cut line's gonna be and mount everything that I need to. I'll go ahead and cut all the way through with whatever size I'm using later on. The last thing to do is to install the T-track. I'm just going to place this in the slot we routed out, drill some pilot holes, and fasten it with the screws that came in. I'm super bummed I didn't show you guys myself using the J-Cat's Moses stop block. I think I was just so excited I forgot to record anything, just like a kid in a candy shop. I'm going to leave a link down in the description if you guys want to buy one. I might do a video just of me reviewing that product. I'm not affiliated, I'm not sponsored by any means. I just think it's a hell of a product and you guys should check it out.
Boom! There, no, we need more oomph. Bam! There you guys have it. Super simple, super functional crosscut sled. Pretty glad I got this Jonathan Katz Moses stop block here. It's absolutely wonderful. I recommend you guys get it. I'll have a link down in the description below. I've already used this on a couple of projects, which is why my shop is an absolute mess right now. But I'm stoked to use this on more projects. I might build different crosscut sleds for different functions, so stay tuned for that. Next week, I'm gonna build zero clearance insert, throat plate insert for my table saw. So turn on those notifications. Hit that like button if you haven't already. Subscribe if you're not already. I'll see you guys next week.